Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CEDH. I am one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobzors, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Matt, aka Null.
Yo.
Reed, aka Sick Robot.
How you doing?
And Morgan, aka Spleenface.
What's up, everyone?
And in this episode, we're going to be covering the skill floor and skill ceiling of decks, and talking about and kind of defining those, and seeing what interesting discussion ensues. But before we do that, what have you guys been up to since the last episode, which I believe was our year in review episode that we did live on Twitch? So I mean, I guess the majority of our listeners would have seen either a VOD or listened to the just the audio for that.
That is generous, because also we didn't put out an audio version.
Oh wait, we didn't put out an audio
version?
version?
There's a VOD on YouTube, but I don't...
Yeah,
we don't.
It's on YouTube.
Yeah. It's audio if you're not looking at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I thought we had. Whoops, my bad. So yeah, I guess for our audio-only listeners, go check out the VOD on YouTube if you want an extra episode. Yeah, finding out now that you have a bonus episode you can listen to. So that was a lot of fun. We went over our. Did we wait? Hold on. Have we not done audio versions for our previous year in reviews?
No.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I don't think so. They don't have episode
well, I mean,
numbers
the first one was like actually just an episode.
Yeah.
Wait, what was our second one? I honestly don't know.
Last year didn't have an episode number.
What? Aren't we third anniversary? I think we've only done
right,
3.
but our first one was like when we were. It was like our 4th episode or something.
Oh, maybe.
It was literally year in review. I don't know. What
anyway,
we at the end of 20. Looks like our first 2 were actually just regular episodes, and then we did the next 2 live.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so go check that out. We covered a lot of stuff about the year. We also did some predictions for the upcoming year, and we reviewed, because I guess if you're an audio only listener, we in our previous year in reviews we'd always do predictions, and so we'd reviewed our predictions from previous years, see how we did. So lots of cool stuff. Interacted with some listeners in chat. So yeah, it was really cool. And next time we do it, come up, be on our Discord, and we post announcements of this sort of thing there. So be sure you won't miss the next one by joining the Discord. But yeah, so since then, have you guys been up to anything interesting?
I've just been waking up at 8 o'clock consistently and drinking a lot more coffee. I don't know what changed.
That's incredibly strange.
I thought I was going in a different direction, dude. I've just been waking up in the middle of the night screaming.
Cold sweat.
Well, I know what Morgan and myself have been doing quite a bit, and that's Vintage Cube.
The Vintage Cube grind.
Yeah.
I think 8 trophies is my personal best.
You've had 8?
Yeah.
Dude, you have been grinding, man.
Did you guys see
Damn.
there was the charity head-to-head between a bunch of streamers doing Vintage Cube?
No, I didn't.
No, I did not.
It had LSV and people in it and stuff. Anyway, it was LSV, Gabriel Nassif, some other streamers. Anyway, it's just because I watched Caleb D a fair amount, Caleb Gerwert, and he had a run where I think over the course of it was a trophy competition, so whichever team ended up with the most trophies at the end won. At the end, I think he had a 50% trophy rate.
Jesus.
Yeah,
that's insane.
Over 20 drafts or something.
And was he
insane?
Was he drafting to trophy? Was he? Because I'm as someone who I feel like you could have a pretty decent win rate if you're drafting mono red or mono white over and over again. But I assume that he's drafting a bunch of different stuff, right?
He is drafting to trophy, but he's not drafting he's not forcing everything the exact same. He's not forcing the same 2 decks every time. He's taking what's available to him and building a different deck every single draft. It was actually nuts.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
I feel like taking what's available actually leads to building the same deck every draft. But
Potentially, I don't know.
Or like the same like 3 decks.
White is open so often. That's why
there's
I view it as the
mono
best
white's so good.
deck in the cube.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
also. Sorry.
No, go for it.
No, I was just gonna say like the charity stream reminded me of there was I was on the Mystic Remoras had their 24-hour charity stream last week.
Oh yeah, right.
Just yeah, I probably should have put it in that, and then when you said charity stream, I was like, oh yeah, charity stream.
Oh yeah, I did that.
And they raised,
cool.
I think they raised $8,000 for
it's actually like
the Trevor
ton.
project.
That's
Oh,
awesome.
what? That's all.
Yeah.
Damn.
It gave away $3,000 in raffle prizes.
I thought you were gonna say they gave away $3,000 of the $8,000.
I just pocketed $5,000. Yeah.
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 It's just a for-profit charity.
Yeah. You know, we should do what the we should start doing charity streams and then do what like grocery stores and stuff do. Just use donations as tax write-off. That'd be so bad, dude.
Yes,
so messed up.
fraud. But not just that, charitable fraud.
It's the best kind of fraud.
If you're gonna fraud, I feel like ethics are already out the window.
Oh, you just go all the way through the deep end. If you're gonna commit fraud, you might as well just go to the nearest orphanage and steal money right out of their hands.
Wow.
All right.
It just feels more personal when you're doing it like that.
Exactly.
Could have left it to the imagination of the listeners, but just had to go.
And
Hey,
demonetized.
it's Christmas spirit, it wouldn't be Christmas without thinking of Tiny Tim and Scrooge. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I guess anyone else been up to anything?
Oh yeah, just stealing money from orphans.
Cool. And we'll leave it at that. And without further ado, let's jump into housekeeping. So in housekeeping, we always like to shout out our new patrons. So big shout outs to Alex O.
And Nicholas A.
Yay! I'm gonna, new year. I'm gonna stop saying the thing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop saying that's I should have added that to our New Year's resolution in our year in review. I'm just gonna stop stealing from the command zone directly. So yeah, I'm not saying it anymore. I'm just gonna say thanks. You guys are awesome.
So we'll
I
steal
love
from
you.
orphans, but we draw the line at the command zone.
Hey Morgan, corporations are people. We're getting off to a spicy start today.
An orphan doesn't have the full might of Watsy to sue us into the ground. Oh, God.
I feel like we should next year
crossed.
in review we should add a resolution, like obviously CDH related, but
100%.
True. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, big thank you to our patrons. You guys, as we say in the end of the show, you guys help let us improve the quality of what we're doing, and it means a lot. Yeah. Thank you guys. Okay, and then new developments. I guess. Morgan, Reed, Matt,
sure.
You guys want to do this?
So we're soft announcing this early, but we're I don't know. Obviously, it's we're talking about Marchesa 2022, which is happening in Seattle at the end of March. I believe it's the weekend of the 26th, 27th. Some of us are hoping to go, obviously.
Yeah, pending current situation.
There's some amount of uncertainty with international travel in the near future.
Pending the Decepticon virus or whatever the...
Yeah, exactly.
The vid.
We don't know, where the thing that we can't say, because, YouTube doesn't like us to say it, will be.
Regardless of the seasonal illness.
Exactly.
It's looking like a pretty sweet tournament.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And we're stoked for sweet tournaments.
Yeah, so hopefully things aren't too crazy and we can meet some of you guys and, say hi from a respectfully safe social distance. Maybe jam some games sitting across the table,
Don't get it wrong though. Morgan wouldn't shake your hand even if there were
anyway. Even if it's a convenient excuse.
You dare touch the greatest CEDH player?
And I'd say it like that too.
Yeah. Well, he has like a squire follow him around and say it. It's truly something extra. So it's almost worth going to the CEDH events just to see it.
Just to see if you can get me to bully you.
Yeah, honestly, I was thinking of cosplaying as Morgan this year.
Yeah,
I feel like that would be the most boring cosplay.
Marchesa 2022. I mean, yeah, I got the bug. Okay, actually, I shouldn't say that. You can't say that now, right? You can't say I caught the bug for in-person tournaments when you might catch a bug from going to in-person tournaments. Like that's maybe not the best terminology to use. But no, going to Tier 1 Con just like reminded me how much I miss in-person events. So like, it would be awesome to be able to go to Seattle and stuff. But yeah, I guess it is definitely pending on how everything goes. Yeah. Look forward to hearing more from us. We'll I guess keep posting updates or saying things and new developments as weeks go by. We'll let you know if things fall through, I guess. But if you want to get a more timely updates, you should go to join the Monarch Discord server.
Yeah, we'll have a link for that in the description.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, so on to our main topic for the episode, which is the skill floor and skill ceiling of decks. So before we kind of get into that and kind of break it down a bit, it's important to kind of understand what we're talking about, because even pre-show there was a bit of confusion. There was a bit of talking past each other when in terms of getting an understanding of skill floor and skill ceiling. So the skill floor of a deck is the minimum player skill required for a deck to be viable, or it's the minimum result of a player with minimal skill. And so these are kind of it's a two-part thing. And so one thing we also have to understand is kind of what does it mean to be viable in CDH, and kind of the definition that I like to use, and you're going to get different results when you talk to different people. But the definition I like to use is in a pod of CDH that where the decks aren't it's not like a fixed pod or anything, but that your deck would get a roughly 15% win rate. And an example is like Goreclaw in mid power. Just stompy Goreclaw. Big fatties. It's going to take some games of CDH. If the pod is especially stacksy, you're going to, you're going to just beat people to death with fatties, and that might maybe if you're just playing against a bunch of random CDH pods, maybe you could even get like a 5% win rate. But we wouldn't really call that a CEDH viable deck. So where we kind of, you have to set the threshold somewhere, and what I like to use is about 15%. And that tends to encapsulate most of what we would understand CEDH decks to be. And then, so that's the minimum player skill required for a deck to be viable, because you can pilot a deck extremely poorly and be below a 15% win rate, and it's going to require some amount of skill to at least bring it up to that level. So that's what that's part of the definition of floor. The second part is the minimum result of a player with minimum skill. So if you're a player of minimum skill, but the deck is just so powerful that even piloting at that level, you're above that 15% level. That's also the floor. One thing I guess that's kind of important to the terminology of floor and ceiling is that when we talk about a deck having a high skill floor versus a low skill floor, we're referring to what is high is not the floor itself, but it's the amount of skill required to reach the floor. So if a deck with a low skill floor means that a non-skilled player can reach that minimum level of viability with it. And a high skill floor means it requires a high amount of skill to reach that minimum level of viability. And
that common 15% floor.
Yeah, exactly. And then so when we talk about the skill ceiling, that is how far above the floor is the maximum performance of the deck. So, this is, if we talked about 15%. So let's say that the floor of the deck was 15%, and that's even with the minimum skill player. If you have a 20% win rate versus a 25% win rate, the 20% case is a lower ceiling than the 25% case. So what that really translates to is the amount that increasing your skill can increase your performance with the deck. Okay, and so Matt actually has some really good real-world analogies that we can use to kind of better understand this concept.
This one, gives me I can strongly visualize this one. So first, a racing bike with training wheels, being kind of the low floor, high ceiling type construction, and then a unicycle with a small wheel being kind of the high floor, low ceiling construction.
Yeah.
Right? Because with the unicycle, you need a trained clown or whatever, or just someone with a lot of time to ride it, but you're not going to go very fast because there's no gear system and the wheel is small. And a racing bike, an actual baby can't ride it, but as long as you're just tall enough, then you don't even have to balance.
Yeah.
But if you do put a very trained person on a racing bike, they will certainly win the Tour de France.
Maybe not with the training wheels on, but
training wheels might
eventually
get in the
training
way.
wheels become a hindrance.
How much would you pay to watch a race of all hyper pro cyclists racing with training wheels?
Honestly, the racing bike itself is enough. I just wanted to add the training wheels on as an extra little.
I fully appreciate the mental image.
And so to help make this even more concrete for CDH and Magic more generally, we've got an example of a CDH deck that fits each of these different categories. So it would be in our first, I guess, Morgan Reed, you can cover these guys.
Well, so we'll sort of lay out what it. So the combinations that we're looking at here are the combinations of what the skill ceiling looks like on a deck and what the skill floor looks like on a deck. So the combinations being stuff like high floor, high skill ceiling, low skill floor and low skill ceiling, and then the in between stuff. So we're just gonna walk through a few of these just to give you an idea of sort of what the deck representatives and not necessarily strict representatives of these archetypes are, but just to give you an idea of what we're working with here. So the first of these would be a deck that has a high skill floor but also a high skill ceiling, so a deck that isn't particularly easy to just pick up and run with, but once you do get going, there's a lot of space to grow and express skill. And the deck that we picked for this is Razakats. I think maybe at some point in the past. No, I think Cats has pretty much always been a good representative for this, because it's a deck that certainly isn't super easy to just pick up and run with. The combo line isn't super compact, even with Oracle in the deck. You have to sort of learn what eyewitness lines are, how to abuse life death, what you use LED for, and sort of all that stuff, not even getting into game plan stuff. But once you start picking up all of that and know how the combo works, know when you're going for cats and basic game plans, there's still a ton of space to work with, and mulligans, game plan decisions, what you're tutoring for at any given point in time, when you're tutoring, that kind of stuff.
So the example of a high floor, low ceiling deck is Prime Speaker Vanifar. So there's a decent amount of complexity in understanding the lines and the pivots and how you sort of need to what you need to do to actually just execute the combo. But once you have that, there's almost no there are very few decision points in the deck where you're you have to decide, like, do I go for it this turn? Do I cast Vannifar this turn? Like, the answer to those questions is almost always just yes. And like, I don't know, it's just really is not really is not that complicated once you get to that level.
Can I cast Vannifar? Yes. All right, we're casting Vannifar. Do I have Vannifar in play and it's not summoning sick? Well, if I'm not going for it now, when am I ever going for it?
Yeah, the flowchart is long for how you play Vannifar, but it has like 3 branch points, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's just like, can I cast Vannifar? Yes. Okay, can I do the combo? All right. Do these 30 steps in a row, and don't mess up. But there's not that sort of like, because the deck's combo package is so large, you can almost always go for a combo, and there's very little room in the deck for like disruptive elements. Like, the one concession to that is that there's like a collector roof. So if you're like, oh, I actually can't go off this turn, you can just like end on a collector roof and then continue next turn. But like, there's not, it's very much not a toolbox deck.
Yeah, 100%. Next up we have the low skill floor, low skill ceiling deck, and I'm pretty sure anybody listening who has listened to any amount of the podcast can probably tell what we're about to say for this one. Our pick for this category is Godo. It's very easy deck to pick up. The combo is not really difficult to grasp. You just sort of pay 11 mana and you win the game. And honestly, in terms of ceiling, there's not much past that. I mean, obviously, Godo players are going to get angry, but I mean, Godo has the reputation.
I wouldn't even think so.
Yeah, Godo has the reputation.
People should know
for
if you
reason.
play Godo. Yeah,
like it's very hyper linear. Yes, you play some number of disruptive elements in a lot of the decks at this point, but like even then, you're still just slamming the disruptive element and then going to count to 11 mana rather than just counting to 11 immediately. Like there's not really a whole lot of nuance there. You just sort of do the thing.
And lastly, we have a low floor, high ceiling deck. So this is a deck that generally will have a pretty simple to execute basic game plan, but then a lot of options and decision points. And the deck we chose for this is Najeela, because obviously, like, the basic combo, I mean, first of all, you have Oracle, which is possibly the easiest combo ever to execute. And then the Najeela math is, like, really not that hard. And it's, a 2-piece combo, and one of them's your commander. But the reason it can have a very high skill ceiling is because it's not a super fast deck. It can often find itself, and because it sort of applies pressure on the board without necessarily winning, it can often find itself in very drawn out games. But it lacks card advantage or consistent access to it lacks consistent access to ways to get more interaction and get more resources to actually fight that game particularly effectively, which means that you have to be very careful with where you're spending your resources and on what, because if you're careless about that, you'll just run out of stuff to do incredibly quickly.
Okay, so now with that covered, that we have some good deck examples to understand this, let's get into the nitty gritty. So what makes the floor / ceiling high or low?
And yeah, this is not like particular cards or whatever. These are kind of concepts, or particular decks for matter. These are like a lot more conceptual,
and like overarching themes between decks that like share some of these traits.
Nah, dude, if you have a demonic tutor in your deck, that's just huge high.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Well, we'll answer that because we talk about tutors here.
See, I mean,
I'll just start things off because this first point's mine. So this particular kind of idea, I think, sets a low floor for a deck typically, and the point is kind of a straightforward / A plus B type win con, and very obvious, consistent tutor targets.
And I would also add to that, it's not just like when you say straightforward or A plus B win cons, it is almost kind of also, we would tend to call these decks very linear, and so that means that it's also the game plan of the deck, not just the win cons as well, right? The deck, it's straightforward, A plus B win cons, but also an example of low floor we'd use is Godo, which is there really isn't a game plan outside of your win con.
Yeah, it's the combination of it having A plus B win cons and also those win cons being your main game plan.
Yeah. And so, Matt, do you want to go into why? You said straightforward tutor targets. So it just tends to be that one way you could kind of almost summarize this, and we'll talk about this more in high floor as well, which is there's not, at any given moment, there's not too many decision paths, right? There's not too many possibilities for you to decide, or it's like, at least it's really, fairly clear. And so, when we talk about the high floor decks, these tend to be toolbox decks, and decks with like many options. So like an example, another example is like Control, where maybe your cards aren't all different in like a toolbox deck where you have many tutors and different possibilities to tutor at any given moment. But a good example could be like Baral, where you just have nothing but counter spells, but the decisions that you're making on what to counter, there's so many people are casting so many spells that you just have all of these options on what to counter, and you need to with something like Brawl, you really do need to get it right. You can't counter everything indiscriminately.
Challenge accepted.
There's also this thing, while we're on Brawl, there's also sort of another, I think, and it's more of a direct contrast to what we were just talking about in low floor, is that in high floor decks, again, a direct contrast to like A plus B win cons, very linear game plans that are centered around these A plus B win cons. The counterpart to that in what would a high skill floor deck look like in that case is a deck that potentially doesn't have good win conditions, has a difficult time winning the game, or you have to assemble more than like just the 2 cards, or maybe your win cons aren't accessible, you can't really find them with tutors, and you need to sort of like plot your way around playing the game until you can actually find those win cons, which is like another reason why you might say that Brawl is a high skill floor, because it's like you can't just go for the win if you need to. You have to do setup, and you have to get yourself into a game position before that point that actually allows you to win the game.
Yeah, it's one thing to play Control in 1v1 where you could make an analogy maybe of juggling balls, right? Where, it's not quite that, reductive to say in 1v1, you're juggling a single ball, right? It's not that easy to play Control in 1v1. But when you talk about Control in 4-player free-for-all, juggling 3 balls at once is definitely, kind of more something to consider. You've got to make sure that none of your 3 opponents are winning and the game is in control, so that you can make it to the late game, as Reed was saying.
I would almost say that like the floor height is also kind of proportional to its goldfish ability. A little bit.
Honestly, that is a good metric that you can use. Definitely not the soul metric, but that is actually a pretty yeah, for sure. Cool. And so we have a along the lines of goldfish ability, we have a little section here on tutor density.
Yeah, and there's kind of multiple ways of rationalizing tutor density, so there's kind of multiple ways that it can affect the type of deck. So just to start it off, I think tutor density can result in your deck having a high floor because you have a lot of cards that you need to remember and a lot of cards that you need to be able to apply based on the board state.
And I think that also that also pairs not just with the density of like actual tutors in your deck, but along with the density of tutor targets for those tutors, can change the sort of like the high floorness a lot as well, right? And in the same way of like having to not forget about cards in your deck, because if you have a lot of tutors but they can only go for one card a piece, like you just like I don't know, you're playing like a Hulk deck and you have 15 tutors but they can all only tutor for Pattern of Rebirth, like that doesn't really affect the floor. But it's as soon as you have like a lot of either like general purpose tutors or like either so like black tutors, or if you're playing like specific type tutors, but like all of your targets are sort of around the same power level but do different things, like that's what contributes to a high floor, right?
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of paraphrase a little bit, also maybe low redundancy in targets.
Yeah.
Because if there's a lot of the same, get the same.
There's a reason why you're playing a bunch of the same cards. I'd assume, anyway.
It's probably so you can draw them, but you know what? Tutoring's great too.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's also, like, as we have here, tutor density doesn't just contribute to a high floor, though, or low floor for, like, a low tutor density, that kind of stuff. It can also contribute to sort of how high the ceiling is for a deck as well. A lot of this is actually in terms of, or actually, I'll say in general, a lot of the stuff that we're actually talking about might be sort of implicit, but a lot of the stuff can affect mulligans really heavily, and that can also affect, obviously, how high the floor is, how high a ceiling is for a deck. But if you have like a lot of tutors in a deck, one way that can affect a high or your ceiling is if you have like an opening hand with basically your only gas is just tutors, and then you have like semantic acceleration or whatever. It can make it really difficult and open up a lot of your skill expression, or a lot of skill expression for the deck, because it like your hand's not giving you a lot of direction on what to go for, and you sort of have to figure that out. Given like here you have three things that let you access any three cards in your deck. How, like, what three cards do you want? And like adding in like some restrictive, like you have like a Whirly Tutor and two Demonic Tutors, or like you have three Demonic Tutors, or you have like a Whirly Tutor, Mystical Tutor, and a Enlightened Tutor. Like that all makes it like super difficult to figure out what you actually want to go for off of each one of those.
Yeah, and the order that you want to go for them.
Exactly.
The sequencing, when you have so many options, the sequencing becomes much more important, and that can be a high contributing factor to the high skill ceiling.
Yeah, low key, I feel like Imperial Seal is actually like one of the most skill intensive cards in the format.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
I was literally about to say, like, I both love and dread Imperial Seal Vampiric Tutor openers.
Oh, with both
They
of
just
them?
get me. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
Because they're obviously very strong openers, but there's definitely a lot of mental math.
I'll say one thing, I guess Vampiric Tutor also has a bit of a higher skill ceiling than Imperial Seal. Because, I guess one thing that you'll see is it is, to summarize something, or to bring back something I said earlier, which is more options. So if you have restrictions on the timing when you can cast a spell, like Imperial Seal versus Vampiric Tutor, Vampiric Tutor tends to be the card with a, if we want to talk just beyond decks, some cards have high skill ceilings and floors or whatever. So Vampiric Tutor is one where I see people will almost always, if they have it turn one, I see people will play a land, pass, Vampiric Tutor, which can be the right play, but sometimes it's the wrong play.
Especially if you're doing it off of a basic swamp. Like, actually, even, like, the land that you play before vamping on end step actually changes it a bunch, right? Like, if you play, like, an Underground Sea, it's a lot different than if you go basic swamp pass.
Yeah, like, the one thing is, like, how dependent is your hand on this Vampiric Tutor resolving? Because if you just have it, let's say you're going first in turn order, you have Vampiric Tutor, and this is the one where I see people kind of get into the most things. It's a bit less so when you're like fourth in turn order or something. But if you're going first, when no one has any lands in play and everyone has their starting 7, you lead on Vampiric Tutor. Well, if you're passing, what you're doing is you're letting your opponent see an extra card and develop their mana. So, maybe someone has a Spell Pierce. If they play a land, have Spell Pierce up for the Vampiric Tutor that you try and do in the end step. It's like, well, they wouldn't have had that if you had just launched it off in your main phase, or you're giving them potentially options to draw into a mental misstep or something. They're seeing an extra 3 cards combined between all of your opponents. So it's not always correct to play an instant at instant speed. I call that instant-itis. But it definitely the timing restrictions and having the options to play cards at instant speed doesn't always make it right. I mean, one thing is, I think we've seen this more with seeing this more. This is probably over the past 2 years, where main phase ad nauseum has really shot up in how often people are doing that. It used to be a while ago that it was like the only ad nauses you're going to see are end step nauses or nauses on top of someone else doing something. It's like, oh wow, it's so telegraphed he's holding up the 5 mana for ad nauseum. Whereas now people are jamming their main phase nause a lot more because sometimes that's right.
So actually, sort of on top of this tutor density, and the next point that we have here. So I'll go over this point, but I'm bookmarking another thing that'll sort of tie all this together. But so another thing that that tutors contribute to this discussion is also, and I think this sort of does tie in with what we were just talking about as well, though. But the idea that you don't always have to tutor for win condition pieces or tutor directly toward your win condition with tutors in certain decks can definitely super bump up the ceiling of them, right? Because then if you're playing a deck that has readily accessible win cons but also is playing a game plan that doesn't always want to be trying to go for a win as soon as possible, that really changes the dynamics of your tutors.
I want to just throw in an example to get in my per episode Gitrog mention. But one of the common mistake that you'll see new Gitrog players make is always tutoring for Dakmor. It's like, well, I'm going to entomb for my Dakmor, or I can Vampiric Tutor. I'm going to put Dakmor on top of my deck. When what you tend to see is higher skill Gitrog players almost are very infrequently tutor for Dakmor unless it's kind of like the win is just right there. And what you'll tend to tutor for is Life from the Loam, which is, a resilient value engine that can also then be used as a pseudo way to tutor for your Dakmor later. So very much tutoring for your for non-win conditions and recognizing when to do that and when it's appropriate is something that definitely contributes to high skill ceiling of decks.
And so the sort of culmination of all this put together, I think, as I was getting into it, with sort of how the amount of tutoring that you're doing, what their tutors are going and getting, how accessible tutors are for you. I think the epitome of all this together and how tutors can make a high skill ceiling in a deck is having tutors in the command zone that don't just win the game. That is I think one of the ultimate indicators of a deck that has a high skill ceiling, and also a lot of the time a high skill floor, just because you have to constantly be aware of as soon as you get your commander into play, all right, what am I tutoring for this time? What am I tutoring for next? How does what I need to tutor down the line going to affect what I'm tutoring for now? This meeting decks we have a couple here. You could probably come up with more, but Yisan, Oswald, 5-color Sisay, just stuff that doesn't immediately end the game when it activates or untaps or whatever, but still you have to do tutoring and you have a wide swath of things that you can access. It just makes them a lot more difficult to play and opens up a lot more room for skill.
What about Zur? That doesn't end the game till your end step.
That's honestly a really good point, Reed, because one thing that I think we've talked about on the show several times, which is the new player recommendation decks. For a long time, I feel like this trend has been bucked somewhat recently. Of Yisan used to be the almost everyone's oh, you're a new CDH player. Yisan, Yisan. And one thing with generally recommending someone a high skill floor deck as a intro to the format is a terrible idea. And something like Yisan, while it does have a somewhat linear combo line that you can memorize, I mean, it's not even just like, I mean, there's so many different branching paths that you can go down depending on what you have to do. But it really, when you're playing Yisan, when you have no counterspells and it does require a lot of deck knowledge from what your opponents have. Because I mean, just an example of, I guess actually it's maybe not the example, but anyway, many of the things that Yisan can do or can find sometimes aren't just things that can be purely reactive. Like sometimes you need to preempt something that your opponent is doing. You need to kind of read what they're doing in the flow of the moment and then be like, okay, now is actually the time to get my answer for this particular win. And then, but if you miss that little window, it could just be too late. So yeah, Yisan I think is a great example of what you're talking about in the command zone, of something that has a high skill floor and can have a decently high ceiling as well. But yeah, I guess the moral of what I'm trying to say is don't recommend these kinds of decks for new players. One of my favorite recommendations for new players is Godo. Even though it's got not the highest ceiling of decks you can recommend, but it's just a very linear deck with a kind of an easy to understand game plan. Can do powerful things, but one thing that I really like about recommending new players Godo is that because they don't have to focus so much on their own deck and extracting maximum value and achieving maximum potential there, they can kind of focus on what their opponents are doing and learning about their decks by playing against them and getting a better grasp on the CDH metagame that way.
Sounds like some naive optimism to me. See, I recommend Nagila because you don't have to focus on your own deck as much, but because you have a bunch of interaction, it actually forces you to pay attention to your opponent's decks rather than just ignoring them.
I think Godo for me would be a good deck for someone who's very new to I mean, maybe not if someone's an EDH or like a seasoned Magic veteran who kind of understands when to use interaction and whatnot. But the fact that Godo can't interact that much, I think, can be a benefit for players who are somewhat new. But then I think definitely going to Nagila, at least going from Godo to Nagila as like a level up as they get better, or if they're already at that level, starting with Nagila is actually a really good idea.
What I'm taking away from this is that you're introducing people to Magic by getting them to play Godo, and that is a war crime.
I mean, getting people to one thing is just like getting people to play
Didn't
EDH,
you say you
introducing
steal
them
from
to
orphans. Like, what are we? You really
introducing people to Magic through
That's a
EDH is like
crime, not a war crime.
terrible idea, but that's something that happens all the time anyway.
It's like the way people get into Magic these days.
It's crazy. It's like, yeah, here's a format with 20,000 possible cards you can play, and everyone's playing 100 card singleton. So I hope you know all of these cards. It's like.
From
Jesus.
the entire history of Magic, and all of them are counterintuitive in the way that they work.
Yeah, the
I do have a point actually for Yisan having a low floor, specifically in the days of I think peak days where Yisan was recommended, which falls into the next point bit, which is resilient win cons. You have to think about when Yisan was popular, console wasn't as popular because the only outlet was Lavman. At least in my mind, that's how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not I think one of Yisan's big problems is it just can't deal with console.
It actually has two tools to deal with console. So now they got endurance.
Still not effective.
Yeah.
It can do endurance. It's
okay. True.
Endurance,
and then
no, it's not cracked up
clean.
to be.
It's not clean, but it does have access to that. And I mean, I guess even back in the day, it would have had something like Loaming Shaman, which I was on, but I mean
you also
most.
You have
I mean,
Glade Muse, which is doesn't beat Labman console, but beats Historical console.
Yeah,
okay. My point being also, in addition to that, Yison's WinCon comparatively was resilient. Like, for just some odd random reason, people couldn't deal with a bunch of creature combos. At least that's how I
apparently
observe
they
things.
still can't.
And they still can't, so that certainly has that going.
Isn't
for
it?
I mean,
Isn't
Toxic
it
Deluge
Hardwood
has fallen off the
Storyteller,
map.
Not Glade Muse that deals with the console.
Wait, what? Is it?
Glade Muse is
Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell,
Oh,
it's
it's the other
that
one.
player's
Yeah,
opponent's draw a
it's
card.
Hardwood Storyteller.
That player, yeah, it's Hardwood Storyteller.
Sorry.
Endurance is kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Especially
I mean,
when your
one
opponent
of
has
the things.
Necropotence, right, Reed? We did that to someone in the 2-color league, and then we were like, oh, well, I guess you could just draw his deck with Necropotence.
Yeah, you can just
we're like,
Necro.
maybe he won't notice.
And then
he
he
did
didn't
not.
notice.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah, he was at like 15 or something, and we endurance for like 13, and we were like, oh no, wait.
No, I think he was at like 13, and we endurance for 15, but like he had 4 or 5 devotion.
Yeah.
And we were just like,
he had like Thorkel, and like there was either like Thrasios or something, and like a fish, and it was just like,
shh.
Yeah, so along with resilient win cons, Matt was talking about kind of being independent of the board state for a low floor. We also have for a high floor.
Well, that's sorry, just to give an
dependent on
example,
board
like
state.
like a resilient win con that's independent of board state is like, I think again the quintessential one right now is honestly a lot of the time just Oracle Consult. It's just like it I feel like it flattens a lot of the skill curve, and that's sort of what contributes to a low floor, right? Is that like you don't really have to care about what the rest of the table is doing a lot of the time. You just sort of jam and it works a lot of the time.
Yeah, like a lot of the skill in Thorkel is getting Thorkel, like getting the combo set up.
Yeah.
And timing it, I guess, yeah. But the actual combo itself,
It's pretty
not
damn
particularly
easy,
hard to execute.
and it's really difficult to stop comparatively.
Which do I cast first, Thoracle or Consult? It's like, well, it turns out actually you can almost do either. So, yeah. So and for high floor, dependent on the board state, I guess I'm Morgan or Reed. We have Hulk here listed as an example. So I'll throw this to one of you guys.
Sure. So
yeah,
like Hulk historically as a combo has, I mean, I guess it's less true now because the hate for it is not nearly so prevalent. But during Hulk's heyday, you'd often have like multiple, overlapping pieces of like semi-effective hate. Things like Deathrite Shamans and like, maybe you're expecting a removal spell, or someone has, Curse Totem was like a very popular card in like the Crixus type decks.
Like Vala, and then there's,
Yeah. So like you have to find sort of a set of cards that lets you answer all of those.
Or bypass them.
Or bypass them, yeah. Which like was often quite tricky. Particularly like when you started sort of in the later days of Hulk, where like cards like Karmic Guide had long been optimized out of the list, so you had like Rector that could get Necromancy that you could use once, and Body Snatcher that you could use once, and then like that was it, and you were out of Hulk pile space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're like, I have 2+2+6, but I need to somehow fit a sack element into the first one, and then like all this other stuff.
Yeah, which was always why it was so funny that like in many ways drawing Nomad's Encore was like the worst thing in Hulk, because it was like it was the piece that you could fit in that first pile with like sack outlet and rebuy.
Yeah.
And then it was like,
it's like, even though it's the easiest thing to cast, it just sucks to draw it because you can't do anything with it. Or like you can't do anything with the rest of the pile. It was really weird. Anyway, yeah, like the Hulk, definitely pre-Oracle Hulk a lot of the time. Was certainly, I think, like one of the epitomes of high floor because of its not necessarily its like it didn't really have inherent resiliency. I guess it did, but it was really more about like it had semi-resiliency to all these things, and when you have to go through and actually fight through them, it makes it so you have to really think about what you have left in your deck, what you've used so far, what's in your hand. Like, is there like a non-combo piece in your hand that you can use to help get you through this? Like, and like, what did you use to get to the Hulk in the first place? Because like, if you use the Rector to get to the Hulk in the first place, then you're now missing a Hulk doubler to like try to fight through hate and all this stuff. Or like, does drawing one of the pieces help at this point? Like, does it help that I have this in my hand? Because now this opens up like more space in the Hulk pile and I can cast it. Anyway, I'm not gonna like circle jerk about Hulk forever here, but it definitely was like, I think it's one of the poster childs for just a super high. I'm not sure that I'd call this a high floor necessarily, but it certainly contributed to a high ceiling in terms of actually being able to win the game with Hulk.
Speaking, I think it's pretty easy to just run into, especially onboard tricks, and that's why I kind of put it as high floor.
That's fair.
And then like knowing your combination of cards that get around what's on board or potentially what's in people's hands. So it contributes to both, but I think for this particular point, high floor is like how I see it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, speaking of high ceilings, we have 3 points here that also just tend to contribute to a deck having a high ceiling. So we've got lots of interaction, and this kind of has to do with having many decision points. Lack of value engines, and this kind of ties back to what I was saying with Baral, where you can't afford to indiscriminately counter everything.
And what Morgan was saying about Nebula earlier as well.
Yep, and then...
Yeah, and also, God, what's the one, the Grixis Wizards one? Anala. I think Anala, in my mind, was like the quintessential, because it's just like every card counts, and you don't get a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, I this last one isn't a point, it is just a reiteration of the theme, which is there's many decision points, and that is the theme that kind of ties a lot of this together. And then, yeah, I guess the opposite of the the lack of value engines having a high ceiling is just consistent, sustained card advantage results in a lower ceiling, I guess, lower floor.
I mean, to an extent, though, it does also, like, it can increase, like, it's a bit of a weird one, because, like, if you have a lot of interaction and a lot of card draw, like, which is also why under the lots of interaction I put sort of to a point, which is that, like, if you have a high enough density of interaction, obviously you can't counter everything, but it starts becoming a little bit more forgiving of, like, maybe being a little bit too aggressive with your counter spells, right? If you're drawing, say, 3 cards a turn and you have like 20 counter spells in your deck, the fact that you like fired one off on something that like maybe you didn't really need to counter sort of starts becoming a little bit more forgivable, even though, like, when you're seeing a ton of counter spells, your theoretical number of decision points increases. Sort of the path to success through those decision points is also broader.
Yeah, like a very proactive deck with interaction that's mostly there to protect its combo, but is also necessary for interfering with your opponents, tends to have especially if there's not sustained card advantage, tends to have a very high skill ceiling, where this is where it starts off with kind of the base level is I should be using this to protect my own combo, so only recognizing the cards that are must counters for my opponent. And then beyond that, it's like, the next level up in terms of upping your skill is, can I, reading the pod, can I bluff, can I bluff that I have no interaction, have someone else interact for me so that I can maintain my counter spells and things like that. Really, almost like pinching your pennies with what you have in those kinds of decks, and the margins can be quite narrow.
What I do actually think that's pretty interesting about some of the things that we like just went over and brought up is that in the way that they can contribute toward have a deck having a high skill ceiling, they can also sort of contribute toward having a low skill floor, especially in the lack of value engines, where if you're not drawing a lot of cards every game, and you don't really have the ability to draw a lot of cards every game, it certainly makes it difficult to plan long term what your game plan is going to be. You have to be relatively flexible toward what you do end up drawing. You have to be like very, very disciplined in terms of rationing out your existing resources. But it can also contribute to making it like relatively easy to just pick up the deck, because you only really have to consider what's in your hand at any given point in time, and like the information doesn't change as much as it does when you're like seeing more and more cards a turn. So you can sort of just be like, okay, well, this is my opening hand, and I have a set game plan at the start of this game, and that set game plan isn't likely to change that much going forward.
Cool. So we just talked about, aspects that you'll see, or aspects of deck construction and just the way the deck is that contributes to its skill floor or ceiling. And one thing that we'd kind of looked at is that there's actually kind of a separate, you could almost look at a separate axis of a deck here, which is how the skill, there's almost like a skill floor ceiling kind of dynamic in changing a deck, right? So either like teching it to a particular meta, or personalizing it, or making trying to make improvements as you see it. Some decks are very forgiving in card swaps, right? Like maybe the combo doesn't have a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of the deck is just redundant. So
look at it. You
go back. Going back to Brawl, it's like if you take out a counterspell and swap it with something else, it might be more optimal, might be less optimal, but generally, there's a lot of give when it comes to what you can get away with putting in Brawl in terms of counterspells. Same cannot be said for other decks. An example that we were looking at was like maybe Inala, for instance, where there's a lot more moving pieces to its main combo. So if you aren't adept at the deck, and you're maybe a bit new, you don't want to tinker with that so much, because you can break it very easily.
I mean,
and I don't mean break it as in in the Magic sense of like, wow, this is so busted and good. I mean, it's a broken toy that doesn't work anymore. Yeah.
I think if you don't know what you don't know about a deck, like when like you're ignorant to particular things, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. You could be kind of brand new. That's where I feel like teching and personalization is just not something you should try, because to the point, like, you won't know what you're taking away. I think it's where you kind of start to know what you don't know, when you can essentially be like, I don't know why this card's in here, but I do know that it results in strong results, so you can leave it in.
And luckily, many decks and primers have guides for how to tech the deck against a particular meta, or like I've got a considering board, or like a swap board or something like that, where it's, oh hey, if you're running against a lot of this stuff, put in this Grafdigger's Cage that we've got in the sideboard, or whatever, cut this card. So a lot of that can be done for you, and save you the grief of potentially just messing up and ruining the deck by accident. Cool. And I guess this kind of brings us to our last point on skill floors and skill ceilings, which is or at least the last one we have written down, and we can freestyle after this if we want, but which is kind of the curve between the ceiling and the floor, because it's not necessarily a linear progression in terms of skill and how much you get out of it, from your win rate, right? If it's minimal skill to get a 15% win rate, and it's at maximum skill you've got like a 25% win rate, it could be that a lot of those gains come towards the later end of your skill progression, right? Like you have to progress a lot in your skill before you start to see real gains, or it could be the opposite, whereas some very minimal improvements in skill result in some nice increases in win rate, and then in order to get that last couple percent of win rate, you really have to level up a lot in your skill and kind of like wring out that last bit of win rate from the deck.
I think kind of surprisingly, you guys might disagree with this, but Cody has a really sharp upturn, really high in the skill input, just in my opinion.
So do you mean that like
when you get very good at the deck, there's like a spike?
There is a spike, yeah.
So that's actually super interesting, because me and Morgan were talking about almost this exact same thing on stream on Sunday. When we were giving away when we recorded this. We never care about giving that away. Because we played a Devil Cody pod to just cap off like 30 minutes at the end of the night, and sort of got into this discussion. And I don't know, like it's a weird one, because it doesn't seem at its face like there's much to improve on once you get the basic gist of Cody down, which is just like, how do you mulligan, and then how do you just go for it?
Yeah, I would think with Cody that it would kind of follow the second example that I gave, where a lot like minor increases in skill can result in a sharp increase in win rate off the bat. And then you start seeing diminishing returns very quickly, where a more skilled the pilot is, it has less and less of a effect on win rate once you pass that kind of like early things with mulligans.
My internal curve definitely works like that, except with one kind of point, which is I think when it comes to interaction, and particularly with sequencing and also judging the power of interaction against the pod, is where you see that kind of sharp increase.
Okay, cool. So that's actually what I was about to ask, because that's okay. I think that makes a bit more sense if we're going to talk about sort of like the meta game plan of like figuring out sort of like when you're going to go for it, or like even if you're jamming anyway, just like trying to think about, I guess, like what interaction the table is likely to have and how much they have about it, and how much they have of it. I mean, I guess like making potentially smaller decisions like, okay, like what mana am I leaving up at the end of this? Like what color of mana am I leaving up at the end of all of this?
I mean, with Cody, color is like a little bit less important.
Well, yeah, but
actually, one thing I think is interesting regarding our previous discussion on personalizing and teching the deck and kind of modifying it. I actually think Cody has, it has a low skill floor to kind of like low barrier to entry to have like, quite good results. But one thing that I do think it has a really high skill, skill floor barrier to entry for modifying the deck. Because I think that there's actually a lot of consideration and things that need to be understood when trying to modify Cody that I think people frequently mess up. And this is beyond just kind of like regular deck building errors, like putting in.
I think
you're talking about patch or something.
I think you could take out all the 1 mana interaction and put in essentially useless 1 mana spells and still get good results.
No, you'd get decent results, but I think like one thing you have to consider with Cody is your colors of like interaction, and how like if you're like the mana, like if you change your interaction too much and like you skew like one way with Actually, one thing I should say about this is I think it matters. So I guess this the list that I took to Tier 1 Con, the Untappers build, isn't even. Keeb and I never submitted to the database. We never finished the primer we were working on. But I guess actually throwing back to our year in review, maybe that's one thing maybe that's just an easy way to finish a primer, because we got decently far in that.
That's cheating.
but one thing I think with that deck, I think this might be more, my statement might be more true for the Untappers build, where you have to be very conscious of how your interaction lines up with the colors of your Untappers. Because if you're trying to, let's say, cast a green Untapper, right? Like Cody taps, you make 5 mana, you cast a green Untapper. If you're trying to defend that Untapper, the extra mana that you have, like, can't, like, you can't use like a Veil or Autumn's, like an Autumn's Veil or Veil of Summer, to defend it if you're using a green Untapper to untap Cody, unless you have that extra mana or whatever. And so, like, the mana base and what colors that provides and what mana you're going to have extra of, and what mana you're spending on your Untappers, what mana you're spending on your protection and or removal or whatever, like, all of that stuff can start to add up, and those kind of considerations are how you modify the deck appropriately. And that's just, I find even you know, having worked on the deck a lot, it's that was something that I was still kind of like struggling with optimizing. Just, yeah.
I feel like, that's weird, because I feel like those kind of adding up, like, compound effects really kind of contribute to a deck's ceiling, more than it does their floor. But yeah.
Oh no,
disagree.
Like, well, I think a lot of this has to do with the deck construction and modifying the deck, because once the deck is assembled, you're kind of dealt with what you're dealt, right? You don't really have to. There's no real decision. I mean, there is some decision of, like, you have 2 Untappers in hand, and you have one, you know, piece of protection that conflicts with one of the Untappers. Don't use it, right?
Getting at here is less about, like, in-game parts of it, and more about, like, Cody is, like, you're losing some percentage points off the top when you make, like, some number of bad swaps on counting mana, but it's, like, relatively flexible in terms of, like, you can shove a lot of bad stuff in it and it'll still do the thing consistently.
Oh yeah,
like,
I guess
taking
that's
out the Infernal Tutor is just, like, such a dumb move.
Profane
like,
Tutor, but yeah.
Puts the Profane Tutor, yeah, that puts the floor, just the deck building floor, just so low in my mind, because once it's in, and, you know, you have the Adnaz or whatever, like, you can kind of just pilot it like an A+B, and, like, you're good.
Yeah, I guess I was more talking about, like, that last bit of eking out that last bit of win rate,
which is a high ceiling.
Yeah, that's a ceiling. In my mind, but I think, like, we can agree to disagree here, because it definitely is subjective.
Sure.
Cool.
Any other points from anyone on the curve between points, or any other points that people want to make on you know, skill ceiling, skill floors, just overall?
I think we're good.
Sure. I guess the one thing I would just, like, say about the curve is that because I think it's sort of often overlooked when you just look at the 2 points, is just that, like, there are some decks that have, like, very interesting, like, maybe the word plateau is, like, too strong, but something similar to a plateau in that
global mins.
no, like, where
it's like it flattens out for
for some amount of increase in skill.
Local
you won't actually see. Yeah, I guess it's kind of a global maximum. You won't actually see a commensurate increase in your results. And it's, you know, a concept that I think a lot of people don't necessarily, you know, isn't necessarily well articulated in a lot of discussions about, like for example, I think Gitrog is kind of a good example of something like that, where, like, okay, there's some amount of difficulty in, like, learning all of the combos, and then, like, then there's sort of a gap where, like, getting a little bit better doesn't get you a lot, but then eventually you'll hit a point where now you're more comfortable with the deck. You know, you're, like, comfortable doing things like spending tutors, not necessarily for your win cons or things like that, like, you wouldn't necessarily do, even though you're like slightly better, you have a slightly better conceptual understanding than just like, here's how to do the combo lines. And yeah, like it's just, something to keep in mind that not every deck's progression from floor to ceiling is like a nice smooth transition. I was talking with Matt a bit before the show for a game I played where you had different options you could select to play at the start of the game. They made these graphs that were like, here's a player's average win rate, and then here's a player's win rate, like given that they chose this, and like for the various different options, there were like actually every different form of curve imaginable. Like there were some that were just like a linear, poor players do poorly, good players do well. There were some that was like, okay, this is just overpowered, like everyone does above average. There were some where poor players did really well and good players actually didn't do like commensurately well. And there's just like all of those patterns are going to exist in something like CEDH as well as in any other game.
I think if we had the data, we'd almost certainly see that as well.
Yeah.
Cool. So one thing I actually wanted to touch on before we close out the main topic, which is kind of just some trends of the low floor, low ceiling, high floor, low ceiling, like these sorts of things where you tend. I don't know. Did we mention that people tend to hate low floor, high ceiling decks?
No, I don't think we did.
Is that true though?
I was trying to think of
Like-
a good time to put it in, but it never came up. I personally dislike them.
I tend to dislike them as well. Yeah.
I think I typically play the high floor low ceiling decks.
Not low floor. I don't hate low floor, high ceiling. I tend to hate. I guess maybe this isn't quite encapsulated in just the high low floor ceiling. I tend to hate decks that have a low floor, a low skill floor where it's like you don't have to be particularly skilled to reach the floor, but that have a very high or that floor is very high relative, or is a high win rate relative to everything else, I guess is what
sure.
I'd say.
But that was out of the scope of the skill ceiling and skill floor. Okay, that you're just talking about easy to play overpowered decks though.
A high low floor versus a low high floor.
Well, I think it just has to be. It has to be that people. I think that there's just a general aversion. It's not just a general aversion to win rate. Just people want to feel like you earned your win rate, right?
So I think what you would call that is a low skill floor, low skill ceiling, but like good deck.
Yeah.
Like a deck with a high win rate, but with low skills, ceilings, and floors.
Yeah.
Because it takes very little to get into it, and you don't really get much out of being skilled at the deck, but it still performs way too well.
Yeah, like Cody, but without interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but if Godo was good.
Godo was good.
Yeah. If Godo was really good, it would just irk the shit out of me, dude. That would be oh god. Yeah, I don't want to live in a world where Godo was really good. I
think for a long time I thought that's kind of what Najila was, but I think I've grown to respect it a bit more.
Yeah. And then I guess one other thing I wanted to add as well was that you find a lot of decks that people would call bad, and I mean I'll use Baral because it's a deck that I work on, and I don't feel
it's a deck that I call bad.
I call bad myself. Yeah, so I'm gonna pick on decks that I play in Treasure. So a deck like Baral I think has quite a high skill floor. I think it does have a high skill ceiling, but that ceiling, like we were just talking about, decks, where its floor is pretty. The power level of the floor is quite high compared to everything else. Even if you're piloting Baral at its maximum, you're using all 10 gajillion of your brain cells working on Baral, playing it. You're just not going to get great results. and then when you couple that with the fact that it has a high floor to even get like the bare minimum acceptable results, those are the kinds of decks that people tend to call bad. And yeah, it doesn't mean that. So and one thing I do want to definitely stress is that just because a deck is bad doesn't mean it's not viable. Doesn't mean it's not CDH. The biggest problem with it is that it does become not CDH if you don't have the skill required to pilot it at that level. So if you hand like we were talking about new players with Godo, if you hand a new player Godo, they're gonna probably be able to pilot it at a level that is CDH viable. You hand a new player Baral, and it's just not gonna be a fun time. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to touch on a bit. And if no one else has anything to say, I think we can move on to listener questions. So, listener Bubs writes in and says, have you all talked about primer writing at all? It may have been in an earlier episode, but anyway, the topic might not have enough oomph to warrant anything else. If so, I was just thinking about when you go into single card discussion, how collaborators on a list can help things, primer maintenance, when to retire a primer, etc.
I think we actually might hold on to this one because I think writing a primer and maintaining a primer probably warrants an episode at some point. Episode. But we definitely do a bit of stuff here. I think helped somebody fairly recently structure their own primer and sort of get started on what categories are like good to have and good to start with. So I'm totally down to sort of share some of that if people are interested. I know you guys aren't. You guys are never interested. But if our listeners are interested, we can talk a bit.
I am interested in maintaining an equal platform for all of us.
Sorry, it was not because you guys are never interested. As in, there's no way you guys would actually be interested in me talking about how to structure a primer. Anyway, I mean, so really, a lot of it is just you have to think about like a new player just out of the blue. I mean, assume a general idea of how CDH functions, but just like out of the blue, I played a couple of CDH decks before. I see your deck on some deck server or the database or whatever. I'm picking it up. I want to know what I need to be able to do, and just look at it from that player's point of view and think about what they need to know in order to like pick up the deck for the first time and just go and run with it. So typically this is like brief descriptions of core combo lines primarily, just to get them going with that. Probably a bit of guidance on how certain cards work or like how certain niche interactions in the deck work that might come up frequently. It's nice to have those kind of things. Single card discussion is nice, but I don't think it's actually core to a primer. I mean, it's good to have. It
can be core if you have some, if you need to explain some cards that are non-obvious.
Yeah, I think really what I feel like people overuse single card discussion a lot of the time and sort of like discuss like every card in the list, when like that can be nice, but I think a lot of the time what you want to use it for is focusing on things that might be counterintuitive or not obvious to an initial player of the deck, and just explaining sort of their purpose and what you use them for, when to tutor for them. Maybe not even then, but just sort of justify some not obvious stuff. I mean, along with that, I mean, you can also give guidance on general game plan and like mulligans and such, but just basic stuff on like how you just get into the deck, and then you can always open it up more in like later parts and do like an advanced section, or just point people to a Discord to answer more questions, and do FAQ there or something like that. You can also just have FAQ in a primer. That's not bad, but you want to focus the primer on the new player picking up the deck, and sort of what they need to know at a base level to like really just play the deck.
I would also.
One thing I want to. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just gonna say, I would definitely caution. You sort of touched on it when you said, someone who's played a few different decks before, but I feel like people have a tendency to like either they go like so in depth on certain things that like it becomes difficult to actually find to actually find like the information that you want. Like if you throw, you know, like if you have a 1 hour lecture to like teach someone, you know, the basics of physics, like going straight to quantum entanglement, you know, like a depth first search. Yeah, like a depth first search is not actually that helpful. You kind of want some breadth first. But also the other trap to avoid is like teaching people how to play CEDH in a deck primer. Also just kind of dilutes like the potentially useful information, and it's not like really a great way to convey that. And I think single card discussions often fall into this trap where it's like you see people explaining why their deck plays Mana Crypt, and it's like, okay, well, that's the reason every deck plays Mana Crypt. And so, like, I guess that's certainly for single card discussion. If you're putting cards down where you're like, this is any deck that plays this card, this is why they play that card, like, that's probably not a great use of single card discussion. Even a card that isn't a staple in every deck. Like, Mana Crypt is obviously an exaggeration, but, like, Mana Drain, right? Like, there are lots of 4-color decks where people have moved away from Mana Drain. Like, they just want all of their interaction to be, you know, 1 mana or free. But, like,
you have to...
If people know what Mana Drain does, and if you're like, oh, we play this because it counters creatures and it gives us mana, it's like, yeah, okay.
So, you know. I think actually a really great way to think about it, in terms of like writing primers, is you're not writing a primer to justify your deck to your peers. You're writing a primer to introduce it to somebody who's new to the deck.
So one thing I want to kind of to talk about with primers here, which is there is unfortunately not there is a difference between a primer for a new player and like a comprehensive deck guide, or like, you know, something that is trying to get into the nitty gritty and be like one stop shop resource for everything regarding that deck. You know, in terms of like, I think the Gitrog primer, big air quotes there.
It really should be called a primer.
The point what I was trying to get at is that the term primer is kind of it's not used appropriately, and kind of the problem is that primer is used to mean many different things, when really what a primer should be is exactly what Reed said, which is for new players. But when you go to Moxfield, right, it's a, this deck has a primer, or click on primer. It's like, well, there's no place for a, here's the primer and then here's the comprehensive in-depth deck guide, or all the resources you want. So really things kind of get lumped into, everything gets lumped into being called a primer. So decks, you go on the deck list database, listed as a primer, and it's not possible to kind of differentiate the level of depth to which people are going. But when you're writing a primer for a new player, very much so, I think everything Morgan and Reed said is just, absolutely crucial. Brevity, not too much depth. Don't over explain how to play CDH, or get into too much of the philosophy or something. But I guess regarding single card discussion, sometimes it might be worth to point out notable exclusions is a category that you'll often see, which I think is actually kind of valuable, because it will answer questions that people are like, oh, I see that this, I guess I'll use my data deck as an example. Why this deck isn't running Mana Crypt? Why I should just slam that in easy. And it's like, well, if you put in a notable exclusions section, you say, hey, I'm not running Mana Crypt because in your main combo line you will die to your Mana Crypt damage while you're looping your turn spells, or something like that. Yeah, something simple like that is often explanation enough.
I think that's the one category that I'd actually say is probably a reasonably good idea to put in a primer that doesn't explicitly focus on new players, is just like specifically exclusions, because those will, putting that in your primer will guarantee you that you won't have to answer as many questions as you would otherwise.
That's hilarious. You think people read that?
the other part of a primer is to reduce the amount of questions that you get on your deck list.
Honestly, that is the end goal of a primer, really. Yeah.
But it's not like it's not really what you should be writing a primer for, but it's certainly a functionality of a primer is to stop getting people commenting on your thing with questions that you've answered a bajillion times already. Anyway.
Well, honestly, I think it's a good thing to use, because if your primer is succinct and well written, you're not going to get questions because people will have read it and they'll understand most of the important things they need to understand. But if your primer is the fucking million-page thing, the Gitrog monster, I'm not going to call it the Gitrog monster
it's the
guide
Gitrog monster
or whatever
monster.
thing. Novel, is then it's kind of a too long did not read situation where people will just be like, this thing is too daunting, I'm not going to read it. So I'm still going to be asking questions. So if people are asking questions and they're asking questions about things that you've covered, that's maybe an indication that things aren't information isn't accessible in a way that is convenient. Matt, I think you were going to chime in.
I was just going to say, and as Reed mentioned, we could probably do a whole episode on primers.
Yeah. Yeah. Some decks, I think, like Gitrog, it's like it'd almost be better served by having like a wiki or some kind of format like that. And
yeah, FAQ.
We definitely tried to do some sort of like that when we were formatting the primer, but it's very. Not only is it daunting to read, it's a daunting task to kind of edit and maintain something of that scale. Yeah. You almost want to have like a separate primer and guide, and yeah. But anyway, anything else on this, or we good to close it out?
I think we're good.
Cool.
I think we're good to close out.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode. If you guys like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email, intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, join our Discord so that you can know when we're doing our any like Twitch streams or anything like that. And also, if you want to participate in a bunch of esoteric CDH philosophy and arcane denial discussion, it's great for that. Extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/IntoNorthPodcast. Another way you can support us is via our TCG Player affiliate link. So anytime you want to purchase something from TCG Player, if you use our affiliate link, which is in the podcast/YouTube description, a portion of your purchase goes towards supporting the podcast, and it's much appreciated. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo, and to our video editor Manta Ray Hat. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then.